The day I arrived at the plant, I remember the air was thick with that kind of dry, electric stillness you only get in the middle of nowhere, the kind of quiet that feels like it's waiting for something. I hadn't even been at the facility for an hour, and already I had this gnawing feeling that I'd signed up for more than just another operator job. But then again, when you've served in the Army as long as I had, you start to trust those gut feelings. The place itself was strange, no doubt about that. Massive in scale for something that was supposed to only power one government building tucked away in the hills. It didn't add up, but I told myself it wasn't my job to make sense of it. I was just there to make sure the generators ran, that the lights stayed on. Nothing more. On the surface, everything seemed normal enough, if you could call it that. The facility was built like a fortress, miles from any town. The kind of isolation that either drives you crazy or makes you forget the world outside even exists. My first look at the control room sent a chill down my spine. A maze of switches and monitors, too many for a plant this size. Still, I'd kept my mouth shut. It was just a job after all, and I'd seen weirder things in the Army. At least that's what I kept telling myself. But the real unease started when I met the crew. Wade was the first to introduce himself, if you could call his distant, haunted stare much of an introduction. He was the previous plant manager, an older guy, probably in his 50s. His eyes told me everything I needed to know. This place had gotten to him. He didn't say much, just warned me to mind my own business. But it wasn't the words that stuck with me. It was the way he looked at the plant, like it had taken something from him, something he couldn't get back. And I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened to him might happen to me too, if I wasn't careful. Then there were the other guys, Clint and Harris. Both technicians, both pale and quiet in a way that made my skin crawl. At first, I figured it was just the nature of the job. Long hours, isolation. Those things could make anyone a little off. But the more I watched them, the more I noticed that it wasn't just exhaustion. It was something deeper, something I couldn't put my finger on. Clint barely spoke, his eyes unfocused like he was looking through me, not at me. Harris wasn't much better, and it didn't take long before I started avoiding them both. There was something wrong with those men, and I wasn't in any rush to find out what. That first night, I got the call. The phone rang in the middle of my shift, and I almost didn't pick up, thinking it was some routine check-in. But when I answered, the voice on the other end wasn't from the plant. It was from David Shaw, the U.S. Secretary of Defense. Now, I'd never spoken to anyone that high up before, and the fact that someone like him even knew my name set alarm bells ringing in my head. His voice was calm, too calm, asking me strange questions about the plant's operation. Not technical things. No, his questions were about me. How do you feel about your work, Derek? Have you noticed anything unusual? I told him I hadn't, but my heart was pounding. Shaw's voice had a way of making everything seem more dangerous than it was, and that's when he said something that really got to me. Keep your head down. Don't ask questions. You'll be fine. He hung up before I could say anything else. The next few days passed in a blur of monotony, but that sense of something lurking just beneath the surface never left me. Wade's warning echoed in my mind, especially when I saw the black vans coming to take Clint and Harris away. It happened every few days. These nondescript vehicles would pull up, and the two of them would get inside without a word. They'd be gone for hours, sometimes a whole day. When they came back, they were different, paler, quieter, like something had been taken from them. At first, I thought they were just being sent on some kind of maintenance job, but deep down, I knew better. Whatever happened during those trips, it wasn't routine. I didn't ask. I couldn't. David Shaw's voice haunted me every time I thought about it. Keep your head down. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more the questions gnawed at me. Why was a plant this big only powering one building? Why did Clint and Harris come back looking worse every time they left? And why the hell was the Secretary of Defense personally checking in on a guy like me? I knew I shouldn't dig, but I couldn't help it. One night, after Wade had clocked out early, I found myself standing at the edge of the plant's perimeter, staring out toward the hills. Somewhere beyond them was that government building, the one all this power was being sent to. I could feel the vibrations in the air, like something was pulsing from deep underground. It wasn't natural. I thought about heading back, about following orders like I always had, But then I remembered Wade's face, his hollowed-out eyes, and I knew that wasn't going to be enough. Something was wrong here, and I needed to know what. The next few days were a blur of routine tasks, but my mind kept circling back to the same unsettling thoughts. Wade had been acting even stranger than usual. The man had always seemed on edge, but now he barely looked me in the eye. He was keeping his distance, and when he did speak, it was in cryptic phrases that didn't make much sense. He talked about rounds, muttering under his breath, as if he was talking to himself rather than to me. I didn't understand what he meant by rounds, but I knew it wasn't something good. Wade had the look of a man who had seen too much. His mind was breaking piece by piece. I tried to get more out of him, but Wade was slipping further away with each passing day. One afternoon, I found him sitting alone in the control room, staring at the control panels like he was waiting for something to happen. His hands trembled as he rubbed his temple, eyes glazed over with some deep internal battle. When I asked him if he was all right, he turned to me slowly and whispered, "They'll take you next, you know. It's not a choice. When they want you, they'll take you." I didn't know what to say. Wade wasn't making sense, but something about his words chilled me to the core. It was as if he was preparing me for something inevitable. It wasn't long after that conversation when I noticed Clint and Harris acting even stranger than before. I'd already had my suspicions, but now it was impossible to ignore. Their movements were too mechanical, like they were sleepwalking through their tasks. Their eyes, those pale, lifeless eyes, never seemed to focus on anything. It was like they were there in body, but their minds were somewhere else entirely. And each time they returned from one of those van trips, they seemed worse. I tried to talk to them, but it was like talking to a wall. Clint, who used to at least nod in acknowledgement, just stared past me now. Harris wasn't any better. Whatever had happened to them, it was stripping away their humanity. I remember one night in particular, just before Wade's complete breakdown. Clint and Harris had returned from another trip to that government facility, and something was different about them this time. More than the usual pale eyes and robotic movements, they seemed disconnected from reality. I was standing in the control room, watching Clint adjust a series of switches when he suddenly stopped. He just froze there, like a machine that had powered down. For a full minute, he didn't move a muscle, didn't blink. I thought he might have had some sort of seizure, but then, without warning, he snapped back to life, continuing like nothing had happened. That was the moment I knew something truly horrific was going on, something beyond my understanding. Wade's mutterings became more frantic after that. He started talking about how they had taken him through multiple rounds, and that he was on his fifth. He wasn't sure if he could take any more. Each time, "It's like they carve off a little more," he said, "like they're scraping away pieces of your soul." I asked him what the hell he was talking about, but Wade wasn't making much sense anymore. His mind was fraying, unraveling under the weight of whatever he'd been subjected to. I didn't push further because part of me didn't want to know, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Wade's fate was tied to Clint and Harris, and by extension, to me. The turning point came when Wade told me he was planning to stop it. "I won't go through another round," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He was sweating, pale as a ghost, but there was a fire in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "I'm going to shut the plant down. They can't keep feeding it." I had no idea what he meant by feeding it, but I knew this was serious. Whatever Wade was planning, it wasn't going to end well. He was losing his grip on reality, and I wasn't sure whether to stop him or let him do whatever he thought needed to be done. Then came the vans again. This time, when they arrived to take Clint and Harris away, something clicked in my mind. I couldn't let this go on. I needed answers. I needed to know what was happening in that facility, what they were doing to my coworkers, and what they were planning to do to me. I'd been told to keep my head down, to follow orders, but this was beyond anything I could ignore. I waited until the vans pulled away, and then made my move. Sneaking into the government building wasn't as hard as I expected. Security was tight, but most of the guards seemed more concerned with what was going on inside than keeping intruders out. I slipped past them, staying in the shadows, moving deeper into the facility. What I found inside was beyond anything I could have imagined. The facility was massive, extending deep underground, with machines humming in every corner. The further down I went, the more I felt those vibrations, the same ones I'd felt back at the plant, but stronger, more intense. Then I saw it, the abyss. It was like something out of a nightmare, this gaping hole in the earth, stretching down into darkness. Massive machines surrounded it, and I could see bodies, human bodies, being fed into them. I stood frozen in place, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. This was no ordinary power plant. This was something far worse, and whatever they were feeding down there, it wasn't human. I backed out slowly, heart pounding in my chest, and made my way back to the plant. My hands were shaking, my thoughts racing. I knew now what Wade had been talking about. The rounds, the treatments, they weren't just breaking people down. They were preparing them for something horrific, something that was waiting down in that abyss. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't go to the authorities. Hell, the government was the one running this nightmare. And Wade? He was too far gone. I was alone in this, and the weight of that realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Whatever was happening here, whatever had started all those years ago, was still going on. And now I was a part of it. After what I had seen in that underground facility, everything changed. I couldn't look at Clint or Harris the same way, and Wade. Well, Wade was a ticking time bomb. Every day, I expected him to snap. I kept my distance, but I couldn't stop thinking about what he had told me. The rounds, the way they stripped away his humanity piece by piece, it haunted me. Wade's plan to shut down the plant weighed heavy on my mind. Part of me wanted to stop him. It felt reckless, dangerous. But a bigger part of me, the part that had seen the horror beneath the facility, understood why he had to try. Wade was spiraling fast. His once incoherent mutterings had turned into full-blown rants, and he started pacing around the control room, muttering about feeding it, and how they had to be stopped. He was pale, his face sunken, like he hadn't slept in days. Every now and then, he'd catch me watching him, and his eyes would lock on mine, filled with desperation. "It has to end, Derek," he'd say, almost pleading. "We have to stop it." I didn't respond. I couldn't. I didn't know if I could trust him, or if he was already too far gone. But one thing was clear. Wade wasn't going to sit idly by anymore. One night, after a long shift, I found Wade in the generator room. He was sweating, his hands trembling as he worked at the control panel. I knew immediately that this was it. He was going to do something drastic. I stepped closer, my voice low but firm. "Wade, what are you doing?" He didn't even look at me. "They're feeding it," he muttered, his voice shaking. "And I won't let them feed it anymore. I'm shutting it all down, Derek. I'm stopping the plant." I froze, my mind racing. Shutting down the plant would stop whatever was happening below, but it could also release something far worse. I had seen that thing in the abyss. It was hungry, waiting. If Wade shut down the power, there was no telling what might happen. Before I could say anything else, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. It was Alonzo, the shuttle van driver. Something was wrong. I could feel it in the air, that electric charge that comes before a storm. Alonzo wasn't his usual quiet self. He was agitated, angry even. "Wade," he shouted, his voice booming off the concrete walls. "You're not doing this." Wade turned slowly, his hand hovering over the control panel. "I have to, Alonzo. You know I have to." Alonzo's face twisted into something between rage and fear, and in an instant, he pulled out a gun. Everything moved too fast after that. Alonzo lunged toward Wade, and before I could react, shots rang out. Wade stumbled back, his hand clutching his side, as blood started to pool on the floor. My heart pounded in my chest as I rushed forward, but Alonzo was already standing over Wade, the barrel of his gun still smoking. "You don't know what you're doing," Alonzo hissed, his voice barely human. "You don't understand." Wade, gasping for breath, looked up at me, his eyes wide with pain. "It's not too late, Derek," he choked out. "You can still stop it." But there was no stopping it. As Wade collapsed, clutching at his wound, the lights in the plant flickered, and a low rumble shook the ground beneath us. The facility, the abyss, was reacting. Something was waking up. I could feel it, deep beneath the earth, stirring, hungry. Alonzo turned to me, his face pale, his eyes wild. "You need to leave," he said, his voice trembling. Now. He didn't wait for a response. Alonzo turned and ran, disappearing into the shadows of the plant. I was left standing there, Wade's blood pooling at my feet, the hum of the generators growing louder, more erratic. The plant was alive, vibrating with an energy that was unnatural, almost malevolent. Wade's eyes met mine one last time, his breath shallow. "Shut it down," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Before it's too late." Before I could do anything. The phone rang. The sharp sound cut through the chaos, and I knew who it was before I even picked it up. David Shaw. His voice was calm, too calm for what was happening. "You've gone too far, Derek," he said, his words chilling. "You were supposed to keep your head down." My hands clenched around the receiver as I stared at Wade's body, rage boiling up inside me. "You knew," I spat, my voice shaking. "You knew what they were doing. What was down there?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Shaw's voice, cold and indifferent. "You're in over your head, son. Walk away. Now, this isn't your fight." But it was my fight now. I slammed the phone down, my mind racing. Wade's death wasn't in vain. I wouldn't let it be. I knew what I had to do. The plant couldn't keep feeding whatever was down there. I had to finish what Wade started. The ground beneath me rumbled again, and this time, it wasn't just a tremor. It was something bigger, something alive. I ran back to the control room, my heart pounding in my chest. The machines were going haywire, their lights flashing, alarms blaring. The abyss was waking up, and I didn't have much time. I slammed my hand down on the emergency shutdown switch, praying it would work. For a moment, everything went quiet. The lights flickered once more, then went out completely. The hum of the generators died, and the plant was plunged into darkness. But the silence didn't last long. Deep beneath the plant, I heard it, the sound of something massive, something ancient, stirring from its long slumber. The air grew heavy, thick with a sense of impending doom. I had shut down the plant, but I knew in my gut that it wasn't enough. Whatever had been trapped below was free now, and there was no stopping it. As I stood there in the darkness, the weight of everything crashed down on me. Wade was dead. Alonzo was gone. Clint and Harris were lost, their minds already taken by the rounds. And now, the thing in the abyss was awake. I had done what I could, but it felt like the beginning of the end. I stood there in the dark, my breath shallow, heart pounding in my chest as the deep rumbling beneath the plant grew louder. It was unmistakable now. Something had awakened. Wade's last words echoed in my mind, his desperate plea to stop the feeding. I'd shut down the plant, killed the machines that powered whatever was happening beneath us, but it didn't feel like enough. The ground shook again, more violently this time, and I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. I stumbled out of the control room, my flashlight cutting weak beams through the suffocating darkness. I needed to find a way out, and fast. The plant, with all its industrial noise and artificial lights, was now silent and pitch black, save for the distant sound of something vast stirring below. I could hear faint creaks and groans in the structure, as if the entire place was holding its breath, waiting for the moment it would all collapse. As I made my way through the narrow corridors, I ran into Travis. The sight of him nearly made me stop dead in my tracks. He wasn't the same man I had known before. Travis had always been a quiet guy, a former scientist who kept to himself. But what I saw in front of me was something different, something horrifying. His skin looked pallid and stretched, his eyes distant and glazed, but he was still there, somehow, barely hanging on to what was left of his humanity. I tried to stop it, he rasped, his voice barely recognizable. But the rounds, they change you. I couldn't say anything. What could I say to a man who was slowly turning into something inhuman? Travis' body had begun to morph, his limbs elongated, his face sunken in ways that defied nature. He wasn't fully human anymore, but there was still a flicker of recognition in his eyes. A part of him remained, fighting against whatever monstrous force was consuming him. "You need to leave, Derek. There's no stopping it now." His words jolted me out of my frozen state. I nodded, too shaken to form a coherent response. Travis moved ahead of me, his body hunched as if weighed down by his own transformation. We pushed through the labyrinth of tunnels and corridors, each step bringing us closer to the exit, but also closer to the abyss. The vibrations under our feet were growing stronger, pulsing like a heartbeat from something enormous and ancient. At one point, we passed a shattered window overlooking the massive crater where the abyss lay hidden. The sight sent a shiver down my spine. A colossal shadow moved slowly beneath the earth, barely visible through the darkness, but it was there. I could feel its presence, its hunger. Whatever that thing was, it had been waiting for this moment, waiting for the power to go out so it could rise. And now, there was nothing holding it back. We were nearing the exit when Travis suddenly stopped. His body shook violently, and I could see the last vestiges of his humanity slipping away. His eyes, once filled with fear and recognition, turned glassy and cold. He collapsed against the wall, his breathing shallow and ragged. "Go," he croaked, his voice barely audible. "I can't hold it off much longer." I stood there for a second, torn between leaving him behind and helping. But I knew what had to be done. Travis wasn't coming back. Whatever was inside him had taken over, and there was no saving him now. I turned and ran, every instinct screaming at me to get out. The plant groaned and shook around me, the ground splintering as the thing below stirred more violently. I could hear distant crashes, parts of the facility breaking apart, falling into the abyss. The world seemed to tilt as I sprinted down the final hallway toward the exit. My legs felt heavy, like they could give out at any moment, but fear drove me forward. Behind me, I heard Travis let out a final inhuman scream, one that was cut short as the ground swallowed him whole. When I finally burst out of the plant and into the cold night air, I collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath. The sky above was clear, a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding beneath my feet. But even out here, far from the heart of the plant, I could feel it. The thing from the abyss. It was coming. I scrambled to my feet and glanced back at the facility. The building was shaking now. The rumblings louder than ever, like some kind of terrible beast was clawing its way to the surface. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I bolted across the open ground, heading for the hills. In the distance, I saw the dark silhouette of the government building, the one this whole nightmare had revolved around. It was eerily quiet, the lights in its windows flickering, as though the power inside had been affected too. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for the monster below to rise. Just as I reached the safety of the hills, the ground behind me gave one final violent shudder. I turned and watched in horror as the entire facility began to sink. The abyss was no longer contained. It was consuming everything around it. The plant, the government building, all of it was being swallowed by the earth, like some nightmare had come to life. And somewhere in that darkness, I knew the creature was rising, free at last. For a moment, I stood frozen in place, watching as the ground continued to buckle and collapse. The rumbling grew louder, more intense, until it felt like the whole world was about to split in two. But then, just as quickly as it had begun, the tremors stopped. The facility was gone, buried beneath the earth, and an eerie silence settled over the landscape. But I knew it wasn't over. Whatever had been trapped down there wasn't gone. It was loose now, somewhere beneath the surface, waiting.